Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hello, Dale, and hello, all of you. So glad to be back, and looking forward to seeing what we're talking about today.
This week, we sail into one of the most dramatic chapters of the Pacific War, the American carrier raids of 1942. If you look back at the first year of the United States' involvement in World War II, it's easy to get lost in the massive battles. Midway, Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, but there's another story, quieter at first, yet equally important. A string of daring raids by U.S. Navy carriers that struck deep into Japanese-held waters in 1942. These raids did not always win battles. They did not always destroy hundreds of enemy planes or sink fleets, but they changed the momentum of the war. They showed that American carriers could go on the offensive. They shattered complacency and forced Japan to divert precious forces to defense. This is a story of how, in the midst of desperate struggle, the United States Navy's carriers went on the offensive, and what it taught the world about carriers, courage, and the future of naval warfare.
Nice. Yeah, I know carriers were a pivotal element from the beginning of America's participation in World War II. They were the ones that were at sea during the Pearl Harbor bombing, and that was the majority of our operational forces at the time in the Pacific Theater, at least. And yeah, I'm very curious to see the depth and breadth of what they did and explore how it impacted the war.
After the shock of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was reeling. Battleships were sunk or damaged. Airfields were lost. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. But not all was lost. Hidden among these damaged ships were the America's fast carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise, vessels that would soon become the tip of the American spear. These carriers could strike without warning. Their planes could fly hundreds of miles. Their decks could launch fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, all without fixed bases. And while the United States regrouped, the Navy's leadership began to ask a bold question. Could carriers take the fight to the enemy? The answer would come in a series of raids that, while often overshadowed by larger battles, helped shape the course of the war. A carrier raid is not a fleet battle. It is not a pitched engagement. It is not the capture of territory. A carrier raid is a deep, sudden, offensive strike. Aircraft launched from a moving seaborne base, attacking enemy territory, and then withdrawing before a counterattack can pin them down. In Europe, the Royal Navy had used carriers in this way earlier in the war, but in the Pacific, the concept was still new and unproven in the face of Japan's well-disciplined defenses. American planners would work hard to change that. The opening months of 1942 saw a series of audacious operations that forced Japan to think again about its security. Let's start with one of the earliest and most dramatic of these raids. Shortly after the U.S. entered the war, Task Force 8, built around the carrier Enterprise, launched a deep strike into the Japanese defensive perimeter, hitting the Marshall Islands. This was not intended to destroy a fleet or seize territory. It was intended to disrupt Japanese operations, destroy aircraft on the ground, provoke the enemy into revealing strength and disposition, and demonstrate American resolve. When planes from Enterprise hit Watji and Maiolap, they found Japanese aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, vulnerable, complacent, and unprepared. American crews strafed and bombed airfields, destroying planes before they could lift off. For the Japanese, it was an unwelcome wake-up call. Their perimeter was not secure. The enemy could reach them. For Americans, it was a revelation. Carriers could strike where battleships could not. It's important not to confuse these carrier raids with the famous Doolittle raid, launched from Hornet in April 1942. The Doolittle raid was strategic, meant to hit the Japanese home islands to raise American morale and shake Japanese confidence. These carrier raids, by contrast, were tactical and operational, aimed at weakening Japanese positions in the outer Pacific, supporting Allied offensives, and gaining valuable experience in carrier warfare. They were building blocks for bigger operations to come. With each raid, the Japanese were forced to reallocate air assets, strengthen defenses, and revise logistics. And all the while, U.S. carrier crews were learning how to coordinate strikes, how to evade enemy fighters, how to support land and sea operations simultaneously, and how to endure long, grueling days of flight operations. Carrier warfare was still new, but it was becoming American warfare. The American carrier raids of 1942 showed three things clearly. Reach. Carriers could strike deep into enemy territory without land bases. Agility. Carriers could hit a target and withdraw before Japan could bring superior forces to bear. And evolution. American naval aviation was rapidly gaining the edge in a war fought increasingly in the air. These were not just raids, they were lessons. Lessons paid for with risk, ingenuity, and sometimes loss. And yet, they were just beginning.
That is definitely a part of the story that I did not read about or hear about when learning about the history of America, specifically in World War II. You don't hear about these raids that kind of built one upon the other to get the experience for sailors and crews and pilots. And really when you discuss testing the capabilities of the enemy, like this, we're not taking over land, we're not trying to destroy something strategic, we're just trying to see how they react so we can get a better picture of how they fight. It really strongly reminds me of the last interview I saw with Floyd Mayweather, the undefeated boxer. And the first many minutes of a fight, that's what he does. If you study what he's doing, he's checking his opponent out. He's not trying to land brutal strikes. If I move this way, what do they do? Okay, jot that down. All right, if I shimmy or shake or throw punches or fakes, how do they react? And then once he has compiled that list, it's go time. And I can see a similar parallel here. Like we're trying to say, okay, what is their reaction time? How do they deploy their forces? What are their groupings? It's all information, and you definitely want that before you take any kind of major initiative. And I'm glad we took the time to do that.
When the first American carrier raids set sail in early 1942, they were not part of a grand, confident strategy. They were experiments. Calculated risks taken by a navy that knew it could not yet meet Japan head on, but also knew it could not afford to sit idle. These early raids were about probing, testing, and learning under fire. The raid on the Marshall Islands was the first real test. Again, Task Force 8 was built around the Enterprise. It slipped westwards into waters Japan believed were secure. There was no intention of staying. Speed and surprise were everything. For the pilots launching from Enterprise, this was a new kind of mission. They were flying long distances over open ocean, navigating by dead reckoning, knowing that if they missed the carrier on the way back, there was nowhere else to land. One aviator later described the feeling as, quote, flying off the edge of the map. When American aircraft struck, they found Japanese defenses unprepared. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground, facilities were damaged, and then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the Americans were gone. The damage was limited, but the message was not. The Pacific was no longer Japan's private ocean. These early raids followed a pattern that would repeat throughout 1942. Carriers would approach under radio silence. Aircraft would launch at dawn. Targets would be struck quickly, and the task force would withdraw at high speed before Japanese surface forces could respond. This was carrier warfare in its purest form. No battleships, no occupation forces, just steel decks, fuel hoses, and pilots willing to fly into uncertainty. Another early raid targeted Wake Island, which had fallen to Japan after a heroic defense by U.S. Marines. For many sailors and pilots, this raid was personal. Wake had become a symbol of resistance and loss. American aircraft struck Japanese installations on the island, damaging facilities and aircraft. While the raid could not retake Wake, it served a powerful psychological purpose. It reminded both sides that Wake was not forgotten, and it reminded the Japanese that holding territory did not make it safe. One of the most innovative raids of early 1942 came in March, when carriers Lexington and Yorktown launched aircraft against Japanese positions at Lae and Salumuau on the north coast of New Guinea. Instead of approaching directly, American carriers launched planes from the south, sending them over the Owen Stanley mountain range, an unexpected direction that caught Japanese defenses off guard. This raid demonstrated something crucial. Carrier aircraft could strike inland targets in support of broader operations, not just ships at sea. It was a glimpse of the joint warfare that would later define Allied success. These raids were not without cost. Aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire. Pilots were forced to ditch at sea. Crews endured exhaustion, stress, and constant threat. But with every mission, the Navy learned how long aircraft could stay airborne, how best to coordinate fighter cover, how to recover planes under pressure, and how to fight and survive in enemy waters. Mistakes were made, but they were corrected quickly. For Japan, these raids were deeply unsettling. They forced a reevaluation of defensive priorities. Air units were pulled back for homeland defense. Resources were diverted to protect outlying bases. Confidence in the invulnerability of the perimeter was shaken. Most importantly, the raids planted a dangerous idea in Japanese planning circles. American carriers were a growing threat, one that needed to be neutralized. That realization would help drive Japanese decisions later in 1942, including the gamble at Midway. For the aviators, these missions left lasting impression. Many were flying obsolete aircraft against an experienced enemy. They were young, they were tired, and they were learning in real time. One pilot later said that early 1942 felt like, quote, being thrown into the deep end and told to swim. But they did swim. And with each raid, they became more dangerous. Strategically, these raids did not stop Japanese advances overnight, but they changed the rhythm of the war. The United States was no longer reacting, it was initiating. Carrier raids gave the Navy confidence and gave the enemy something to worry about. And that shift in momentum mattered more than bomb damage ever could.
I think it is really, when I talk about learning something new with my kids and how much they hate it because it's hard, I remind them that doing anything for the first time or something new, unless you're preternaturally gifted in some way, it's going to be difficult and you're going to be bad at it for a while. And even with the training that the troops received prior to being deployed, there's a lot of things to learn. There's a lot that's new. And so I imagine, yes, this is very much like being thrown in the deep end, but how they approach it and with the discipline that they hold on to, just like, yep, this is going to be difficult, but we're going to do it. And they push through. And that really is a marker of a successful mindset, for lack of a better term. And I like how they were able to practice many of their applied skills in ways that were risky but not direct conflict per se, or apples to apples. Having a carrier raid is very different than a sea battle, right? And gosh, I always try to put myself in their shoes when you're talking about what they went through, and it is extraordinary how they handled this.
Now, while the Doolittle raid does not technically fit into this, it is still worth talking about. Because when people hear carrier raid in 1942, there is one image that rises above all others. Army bombers on a Navy carrier pointed towards Japan itself. The Doolittle raid was unlike anything that had come before, and unlike anything that would come after. But it belongs squarely in the story of the American carrier raids of 1942 because it captured the spirit of that year better than any other operation. It was bold, it was risky, and it was born from desperation. In early 1942, the United States needed something it could not measure in ships or aircraft. It needed belief. Pearl Harbor still loomed large, Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific, and Allied morale was strained. President Franklin Roosevelt asked his planners a simple question. Can we hit Japan? The Navy and Army worked together on that answer seemed impossible and implausible. Medium bombers, Army bombers, would launch from a Navy carrier, strike Japan, and continue on to China. There would be no landing back on the ship. It was impossible. It was a one-way flight. The carriers Hornet and Enterprise formed the heart of the task force. For Hornet's crew, the mission felt surreal. They watched Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bombers being craned aboard. Aircraft far larger than anything normally launched from a carrier deck. Pilots practiced short takeoffs repeatedly, knowing that a mistake would send them into the sea. On April 18th, 1942, after being sighted earlier than planned, the decision was made to launch. Hundreds of miles further from Japan than intended. There would be no turning back. Sailors lined the deck in silence as each bomber roared forward. One by one, the B-25s lifted off, barely, clearing the bow with feet to spare. The crew knew the odds. They were not expected to return. Yet, every plane launched. For the sailors watching, it was one of the most unforgettable moments of the war, sending men towards a target no American aircraft had ever struck. The damage inflicted on Japan was militarily modest, but the psychological impact was enormous. Tokyo had been bombed. Japan was not invulnerable. The war had reached home. For the American public, the raid was electric. For the Japanese high command, it was humiliating and alarming. Defensive forces were pulled back. Carrier doctrine was reassessed, and a dangerous conclusion was reached. American carriers had to be destroyed. That conclusion would help drive Japanese planning towards the decisive battle they sought at Midway. The Doolittle raid did not stand alone. It was part of a continuum, one raid among many, but it demonstrated what carrier power could achieve beyond pure naval combat. It showed carriers could project power far beyond the fleet, that it could surprise could outweigh raw strength, and psychological effects mattered as much as physical damage. These lessons would echo through the rest of 1942. Now, many of the raiders were captured. Some of them were executed. Others endured years of imprisonment. Their sacrifice was real and permanent. Carrier raids in 1942 were not clean operations. They carried consequences measured in lives. That reality never faded for the men who planned and flew them. After April 1942, American carrier commanders believed more strongly than ever in offensive action. They had seen its effects, and the Japanese now feared it. The stage was set for the next phase of the carrier war, where raids would give way to decisive battles, and the lessons learned in hit-and-run attacks would be tested under fire.
Okay, so I need to make a correction to what I said earlier. This was not risk-free. I think I made it sound like, oh yeah, this is just a milk run and everything's easy and their learning experience and Japan isn't fighting back and oh, how wonderful. That's not the case at all. And I know just throughout the entire conflict of World War II, there were huge mistakes that we made because we planned one way and it wasn't good. And I remember even in practicing for the D-Day invasion, for example, we lost 10,000 troops in a practice run. That's crazy. Like to the modern American mind, losing 10,000 troops, not even in battle, what was that for? What a waste. But they are learning everything. They're developing new technologies and vehicles. This is only 40 years after Kitty Hawk. Like, flight is new, and all of a sudden we're launching planes off of a runway at sea? That's incredible. The commanders at this time watched flight develop in their lifetime. And so, yeah, everything is risky. And that on top of facing an enemy with a stalwart mindset that is dead set at victory, nothing is safe. But I do appreciate, in spite of all of that, them trying to do their best to really rattle their cage.
By late spring of 1942, something subtle but profound had happened in the Pacific. The era of raids was ending. Not because they had failed, but because they had worked. The American carrier raids of early 1942 forced the Japanese Navy to confront a reality it had hoped to avoid. The United States was not merely surviving, it was learning, and learning fast. From the Japanese perspective, the carrier raids were deeply unsettling. The Marshall Islands, Wake, Lae, and Samoa, Tokyo itself. These strikes exposed the weakness of Japan's defensive perimeter and shattered the belief that distance alone could protect the empire. Japanese planners reached a dangerous conclusion. The American carriers must be destroyed in a single, decisive battle. That belief would drive Japanese strategy through the middle of 1942, culminating in two carrier battles that would define the war. First, the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in May 1942, was the first time in history that opposing fleets fought without ever seeing one another. Aircraft, not guns, decided the outcome. And the lessons learned during the raids were suddenly critical. American pilots were now accustomed to long overwater flights. Carrier crews understood rapid launch and recovery cycles. Commanders had experience coordinating strikes under pressure. Coral Sea was not a clean victory. USS Lexington was lost, but it stopped the Japanese advance towards Australia. Just as importantly, it proved something essential. Carrier warfare was now the center of naval combat. 1 month later came Midway. If the early carrier raids had been experiments, Midway was the final exam. Japanese planners believed they were luring American carriers into a trap. What they did not realize was how much the Americans had learned since February. From the raids, the Navy had learned how to strike aggressively, how to accept risk, how to coordinate different air groups, and how to exploit enemy mistakes. At Midway, American pilots flew missions that bordered on suicidal. Many never returned. But the experience gained in early raids gave commanders the confidence to press attacks, even when planes fell apart. The result was catastrophic for Japan. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed.
Ooh.
The balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. It is tempting to view the raids of early 1942 as sideshows, dramatic but secondary. That would be a mistake. These raids served as live fire training, tactical experimentation, psychological warfare, and strategic signaling. They forged a carrier force capable of standing at Midway when everything was on the line. Without these early raids, the outcome of later battles might have been very different. Many of the pilots and sailors who flew the raids were the same men who fought at Coral Sea and Midway. They carried lessons forward: which attack profiles worked, how to spot enemy defenses, how to keep flying when planes collapsed. They were no longer green. They were veterans, and that mattered. After Midway, American confidence surged. Not arrogance, confidence. The Navy now knew that carriers could win wars. The raids of early 1942 had proven possibility. Midway proved reality. And from that point forward, the Pacific War would be fought on American terms. By late 1942, the United States no longer needed raids to make a point. It had carriers in numbers. It had trained air crews. It had doctrine forged under fire. The carrier raids of 1942 had served their purpose. They were the bridge from desperation to dominance.
So my introduction to the Pacific theater of World War II was at the 7-Eleven by my house in the form of an arcade cabinet called 1942. And you're in a P-38 Lightning, and you're shooting zeros, and that's all I knew. Not the most clear or perhaps historically accurate representation of the conflict. Lots of fun. Ate a lot of my quarters. But I think, yeah, and then there was a sequel, 1943, Battle of Midway, also successful. But I always found it interesting that it was a Japanese designer that created this game, knowing that, oh yeah, the good guys, they're the Americans, and the goal is to reach and bomb Tokyo. And they could have that perspective even just 40 years on. When I did finally learn a little bit more about the conflict itself, that battle, the Battle of the Coral Sea, was pivotal. And then likewise Midway, and just the industrial capacity that America was able to produce new ships as we were losing them, while Japan was unable to do so just because they didn't have steel, or not in quantities that America had, for example, or petroleum. Like, their process wasn't as industrial, they didn't have the resources, and like we mentioned in an earlier episode, when Americans destroyed a ship, a lot of veterans went down, like a lot of Japanese, very well-experienced pilots. They're gone and irreplaceable. And so as the momentum starts building for America, like it really ramps up. Not to say that it gets easier, because again, this is a very resolute enemy. But this definitely is a pivotal moment in the war.
Carrier raids look clean on a map. Arrows sweep across the Pacific. Targets are circled. Dates are neat and orderly. But for the men who carried them out, these raids were anything but clean. They were exhausting. They were uncertain. And often they were terrifying. In early 1942, many American naval aviators were barely out of training. Some had fewer than 200 flight hours. Many had never seen combat. Almost none had fought a war where the nearest land might be hundreds of miles away. Carrier aviation demanded precision, and offered no forgiveness. Miss your landing pattern, and the ocean waited.
Yeah.
Lose the carrier, and fuel decided your fate. Yet these men flew anyway. A raid usually began before dawn. Pilots climbed into cramped cockpits, engines coughing the life in the dark. There were no catapults for many aircraft, just full throttle and a short deck. Once airborne, the carriers disappeared behind them. Now came hours of flying over empty ocean. No landmarks, no radio chatter, just compass headings, fuel gauges, and trust. One aviator later said the silence was the hardest part, knowing that if something went wrong, there was no one to help. When the target finally appeared, the calm vanished. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Tracers reached upward. Fighters clawed for position. Pilots dove through flak, lined up targets, and released bombs at altitudes that left no margin for error. Many remembered the strange clarity of those moments, training taking over, fear pushed aside by focus. Some never made it out. While pilots flew, deck crews fought their own war. Aircraft were spotted, fueled, armed, and launched in rapid succession. One mistake, one spark, could turn the flight deck into an inferno. These sailors worked inches from spinning propellers and live ordnance, often for 18 hours straight. They slept when they could. They ate when they could. And they waited, counting aircraft as they returned. Every missing plane was a punch to the gut. Ask any carrier veteran what they remembered most, and many will say the same thing. Waiting for the last aircraft to return. Pilots low on fuel. Planes damaged by flak. Smoke on the horizon. Was it a carrier or something else? Sometimes plane landed with seconds of fuel left. Sometimes they didn't land at all. These moments forged bonds that lasted a lifetime. Despite the danger, life aboard carriers found strange rhythms. Jokes were told, nicknames stuck, rituals formed. Humor became armor, a way to keep fear at bay. One sailor later said that if you stopped joking, it meant you started thinking too hard about tomorrow. Carrier raids did not pause for mourning. A plane went missing, and the next mission was already being planned. There were no funerals at sea during raids, no long reflections. Grief was packed away, postponed until later, sometimes forever. This emotional compression took its toll, but it also kept the war moving forward. The men of the 1942 carrier raids became the backbone of the Navy that would fight through 1943, 44, and 45. They carried lessons written in experience, how fear feels and how to function through it, how fragile aircraft and ships can be, and how much teamwork matters, and how thin the line between survival and loss really is. They were learned over open water, under fire. The success of the carrier raids of 1942 did not come from technology alone. It came from people willing to accept risk repeatedly when the outcome of the war was still in doubt. They were not legends yet. They were just doing their jobs.
Wow, that is... So I've had many cross-country or even interstate trips that are long and boring. And there are many times, for example, there was one time we drove from Houston to Los Angeles in college. We wanted to be on The Price is Right. And we got in the studio audience and it was fantastic. But anyway, there is a stretch of highway in Arizona that is remarkably featureless. Like I-10, there's nothing. And I remember seeing a windmill, and I was like, wow, it's something. And I have a picture of the windmill because it was something on a road that was barren. And that's nothing compared to flying over open ocean like you were talking about, relying on a compass heading and an estimate of where the target will be. And if you're off a little bit, as far as directionally, There's no guidepost, there's no indicator. It's just, oh, it should be here, but it's not. Especially when you're targeting other ships. What a remarkable amount of trust and coordination that needs to happen to do that. And then also not being able to communicate over the radio because that'll get intercepted. That's a lot of steeled conviction. Just like this, I have a mission, I'm doing it, and here we go. A lot of unknown. And when you were talking about the margins of error and how slim they are, when we broke down, we could pull over to the side of the road. If they break down, it's ocean. And finding one little tiny plane in a humongous ocean is almost impossible. And so this took a lot of guts to do this.
By the end of 1942, the American carrier raids that once seemed desperate and improvised were already fading into something else. They were becoming history. History has a way of smoothing over uncertainty, and it's important to remember just how uncertain the outcome once was. So let's ask the question plainly. What did the American carrier raids of 1942 actually achieve? These raids did not win the war. They did not stop Japan's early conquests outright. They did not destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy. They did not save every threatened Allied outpost. What they did instead was more subtle and arguably more important. They changed the direction of the war. Carrier raids gave the United States momentum at a time when it had little else to rely on. That initiative still mattered, even when resources were scarce. One of the most powerful effects of the raids was what they forced Japan to do. Defensive fighters were pulled back from the front. Airfields were reinforced instead of expanded. Commanders worried about attacks from directions once thought impossible. Every aircraft guarding the home islands was one less aircraft pressing the offensive elsewhere. That diversion of effort mattered. It stretched Japan's resources thinner at the worst possible time. Wars are fought in minds as much as on maps. For Americans in early 1942, carrier raids restored belief that Pearl Harbor was not the end, belief that the Navy still had teeth, belief that Japan could be reached and hurt. For Japan, the effect was the opposite. Confidence eroded, certainty cracked, and urgency crept into planning. The raids introduced doubt, and doubt can be deadly. Before 1942, carrier warfare was still evolving. The raids forced rapid innovation. Better coordination between fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. Improved flight deck operations. More flexible command and control. Realistic assessments of aircraft performance. Mistakes made during raids were corrected before they could be fatal in larger battles. In this way, the raids acted as rehearsal with real consequences. The carrier raids also shaped leadership. Admirals learned when to press forward and when to withdraw. Air group commanders learned how to adapt when planes unraveled. Junior officers learned how much initiative mattered in combat. This generation of leaders would guide the Navy through Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific, and beyond. Their judgment was sharpened early under fire. It is important not to romanticize the raids. Aircraft were launched, pilots were killed or captured, and families waited for news that sometimes never came. The raids demanded sacrifice from people who knew the odds and accepted them anyway. That cost must be acknowledged. Victory does not erase loss. If 1941 was shock and 1943 was resurgence, then 1942 was the crucible. The carrier raids of that year forged a Navy capable of sustained offensive action. They transformed carriers from experimental platforms into the centerpiece of American naval power. By the end of the year, the United States no longer wondered if carriers could carry the war. They knew they would. These raids sit between two eras of naval warfare. the battleship age that was ending and the carrier age that was beginning. In 1942, that transition was still incomplete, still contested. The carrier raids pushed it forward decisively. Seen from the end of the war, the raids may appear small, but seen from early 1942, they were acts of courage performed in the shadow of defeat. They mattered because they happened when success was not guaranteed. And that is what gives them weight.
This is pretty stupendous. I think when you think about moments in history where military strategy changes around technology, as simple as the stirrup or the crossbow, but it just forced people to change how they viewed, we're going to have to attack differently. And I think the carrier has been such a sophisticated and really impactful piece of technology. And to know that, again, so shortly after flight was developed, winged aircraft, it's extraordinary. And I don't know if we would have come along as quickly if it weren't for a couple of world wars that boosted the technology or the pursuit of the edge over the enemy. But my goodness, having to learn all these things, and then people in aviation school today, with all I'm sure the aircraft are significantly faster, but all the safety checks, all the different sensors and abilities, like it's a pretty mature technology at this point. But these guys are trying something new completely with an enemy that's also trying something new. So who knows how it'll go? It's interesting with our perspective to be able to see backwards and see how impactful it was. And who knows what that next technology is going to be. The carrier's been the centerpiece for a long time, since this era, I would say. But I don't know. We'll see what's next.
History often remembers the victories, the battles with names etched into memory. Guadalcanal, Midway, Leyte Gulf. But history is shaped just as much by what happens before victory becomes possible. And that's where the American carrier raids of 1942 belong. They were not decisive battles. They were not overwhelming triumphs. They were moments of initiative taken when certainty was in short supply. In early 19, the United States Navy did not know the Pacific War would end. It did not know if its carriers would survive. It did not know if its pilots were ready. And it did not know if its doctrine would hold under pressure. What it did know was this: doing nothing was not an option. The carrier raids were acts of decision, proof that action itself could shape outcomes. The raids forced a fundamental shift in naval thinking. Warships no longer existed only to seek other warships. Territory no longer defined reach. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Aircraft carriers turned the ocean itself into maneuver space. This idea, radical in 1942, is now foundational. Modern naval power still rests on the principles tested during those early raids: mobility, surprise, initiative, and speed. The tools have changed. The logic has not. For the men who flew and fought these raids, there was no sense of legacy. They were not trying to make history. They were just trying to survive and to do their jobs well enough that others might have a chance tomorrow. Some would live to see victory. Some would not. All contributed to something larger than themselves. That human thread, young pilots navigating by compass and courage, deck crews counting aircraft in silence, is what gives these raids their enduring power. The carrier raids of 1942 endure because they remind us that wars are not won all at once. They are won through accumulation of experience, of confidence, and of belief. Each raid added a small weight to the scale until it finally tipped. By the end of World War II, the United States Navy operated the most powerful carrier force in history. That dominance did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, painfully, beginning with the raids launched from the decks that might not be there when planes returned. The road to victory ran through uncertainty, and the men of 1942 walked it first. When we look back at the American carrier raids of 1942, they are not just looking at operations. We are looking at a moment when initiative mattered more than strength and courage mattered more than certainty. That lesson remains relevant today, not just for navies, but for anyone facing an uncertain horizon. Here, we believe that history lives in decisions, especially the hard ones. The American carrier raids were such decisions. They were the sound of a Navy learning to fight and learning to believe again.
When we dig into the history of the U.S. Navy on this podcast, especially these last several episodes, it's been really interesting to me to see how the organic growth has happened in what has become just an exceptional fighting force. Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes based on decisions that may have been contradictory on the surface, but there has been an active pursuit of excellence all along the way. And it's like you said, it's like adding one little weight to the scale, slowly just building and building until you have something that you think is a fairly good fighting force. But yet you're never satisfied to rest on your laurels. We're never going to, I hope, those in command will never assume that, oh yeah, we've got it figured out, we're untouchable, because that's precisely what the Japanese thought during this campaign in this episode. I like the adaptability that America demonstrates repeatedly, but in this campaign specifically. And that's really what wins wars, is the ability to make decisions, take feedback, change based on those decisions, and then move forward and just constantly be active and never be passive. A remarkable lesson for all of us.
At the end of our episodes, we like to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us. And today we want to honor Specialist Jackson D. Johnson. His hometown was Hillsboro, Missouri. Served with the U.S. Army, 657th Transportation Company, 419th Transportation Battalion, 103rd Sustainment Command, Mount Vernon, Illinois. He received the this is a hard word. Meritorious Service Medal. His date of sacrifice was March 5th, 2019, in North Kuwait. He was 20 years old. Specialist Jackson D. Johnson's family had roots in Tennessee and moved to Hillsboro, Missouri in 2015. According to his mother, Jackson enlisted in the Army Reserves a year later because he wanted to make a difference in the world. Johnson enlisted at age 17 while still at Hillsboro High School, spending a few days a week in the Future Soldiers training program. He attended basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in the Missouri Ozarks. In the summer of 2016, before finishing his senior year of high school, after graduating in 2017, Johnson completed advanced individual training at Fort Lee in Price, George County, Virginia. Assigned to the Army's 657th Transportation Company out of Belleville and Mount Vernon, Illinois, Johnson was deployed to Kuwait in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, a multinational effort to eliminate the terrorist group ISIS. ISIS was a violent Sunni jihadist group that claimed authority over all Muslims worldwide and threatened to take over the Middle East. According to the U.S. State Department, ISIS was a global terrorist threat that engaged in gross, systemic abuses of human rights, indiscriminate killing, and deliberate targeting of civilians, mass executions, kidnapping of civilians, forced displacement of Shia communities and minority groups, killing and maiming of children, along with numerous other atrocities. The United States and a coalition of partner nations in the Middle East and around the globe launched Operation Inherent Resolve to end the ISIS threat. Specialist Johnson was part of this operation and was assigned to Camp Arafjan, south of Kuwait City. Camp Arafjan was a forward deployment camp for military personnel on their way to or from Afghanistan Iraq, or other countries in Southwest Asia. The camp housed elements of the U.S. Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and National Guard, and was also a forward deployment camp for forces from Australia, Canada, Romania, Poland, and the United Kingdom. On March 5, 2019, Specialist Johnson was traveling in North Kuwait when a civilian water truck ran a stop sign and crashed into the side of his vehicle. Johnson, aged 20, along with fellow soldier Sergeant Holly Bolonsky of Piccaninnyville, Illinois, was killed in the accident. According to Johnson's family, Jackson Johnson had impressed his sergeants and commanders as a leader. Specialist Johnson had planned to return to the U.S. and move up in rank after his deployment, planning a future of service for his country. Johnson was considering the military police or infantry after his Army Reserve contract was completed. Lost while serving to eliminate the ISIS threat, both Specialist Johnson and Sergeant Bolonsky were posthumously awarded the Meritorious Service Medal. So, Specialist Jackson D. Johnson, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Christoph, get us out of here.
All right. Thank y'all for listening to this podcast. I hope you learned something. I always do every episode because there's just some element that I was just like, oh, I didn't learn that when I was in school. And that's really interesting how it built to the things that I do understand and building connections and understanding the human element in every single aspect. It's just really incredible. Like even when we honor the heroes at the end, our military is composed of actual people that have individual stories and have made decisions to make the world a better place. No? Okay. I was trying to be nice. Anyway, I do want to say that I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you want to get a hold of us, maybe you also served on a carrier like our esteemed host Dale, and you have some feedback, or maybe someone in your family served on some of those carrier raids, and you have some insight. Let us know. There's a couple of different ways you can get a hold of us. One, you can email us. Email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X-Twitter. The handle is USNHistoryPod. We're also on Discord. We have a Discord server. You can go in the show notes, find it there, log in, join, and talk with other listeners as well, and us. And finally, if you could rate and review this show, we'd really appreciate it. It helps us get the word out, gets more momentum, and then more people out there can hear stories about U.S. naval history. And it's really nice that you've chosen to spend time with us. Really appreciate that.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Bye, everybody.
Take care.